and welcome to this tutorial on models in 3D scenes. In this tutorial, we are going to delve deeper into the 3D capabilities of SuperMap iDesktop. So let's get started. So this is how this tutorial is going to go. We are going to start off with talking about 3D symbolization, followed by rapid modeling by vector stretching. We will then talk about 3ds Max models, animation models, oblique photographic models, and BIM models. So let's start with 3D symbolization. So what SuperMap iDesktop allows us to do with 3D symbolization is that we can use vector rendering. Now what that does is that it takes 2D points, lines, and polygons, and it symbolizes them in a 3D space. So we're going to see how that is done by means of an exercise. We're going to go ahead and open the Rapid Modeling workspace. We're going to load all the data sets in the Rapid Modeling data source into a new spherical scene, and we're going to reorder the layers. This will be followed by rendering the street map point layer, and finally we will render a tree point layer. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so what we're going to do is that we are going to be opening our data source for this task. We're going to right click, say open file data source, and rapidmodeling.udb, say open. So we're going to expand this, and we're going to go ahead and say new spherical scene. And once this is done, we're going to select all our data sets within our rapid modeling data source, and we're going to go ahead and drag and drop this onto this 3D scene. Now before we zoom into it, we're going to rearrange this by taking the ground layer and bringing it all the way down. Now since the layers on the top are going to take precedent over the layers at the bottom, so naturally we need the ground layer to be at the bottom since it is going to be the base of the 3D scene. So let's go ahead and double click on ground so that we can zoom into our layer. Let's zoom out a bit, and there we have it. We have a rough sort of 2D scene going on here with some water animation, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to make this beautiful right then. So we're going to start with putting some street lights onto this, street lamps onto this layer. Right, so let's start with our street lamp point layer. So we're going to say right click, and we're going to say layer style settings. We're going to import the marker library 3D from our data folder, add symbol library, data, symbol resources, marker library, say open, right then. So there it is, marker library 3D. We can expand this, go into street lamp, and let's say we will select this one. Now we can use the Z scale to increase the size. Let's say we want an F3. So we're going to apply. Right, so there we have it. We have some 3D lamps on our scene here. Alright, so let's go ahead and add some trees to our scene. So adding the trees is going to be a little different since we want 3 different types of trees. So in order to add different types of trees, we're going to create a thematic map. We're going to say right click, create thematic map, unique values map, and default. Say OK. Now here we're going to select a unique expression, and we're going to say here tree type. So we have 1, 2, 3 different types of trees. Now we're going to say styles, marker style, and here we're going to go into our marker library, and we're going to say tree. And let's say we want this one here, and same as the lamp, we're going to make it 3 times and say apply. So there we have one type of tree. Let's move on to the second one. Same thing, marker style, library, tree, and let's say we want a tropical one, maybe this one, same as before, 3 times, apply, okay. Here we have our second one. They look a bit small, so let's increase the size a bit. Go back here. So let's say make it 5. Right, so they look symmetrical now. Right. So last one, same thing, marker style, library, tree, and let's say we want a willow tree. Let's make it 4. That looks a bit big, so we're going to reduce the size. Let's say down to 3. Alright, so that looks better. Okay. So now what I need you to do on your own now is to create some cars and some trash cans on the scene. Now, the trash cans, because they're going to be the same, are going to be added in the same way as the street lamps. And the cars, they're going to be unique. So they're going to be created in the same way as the trees. Right, so this is what we're going to do now in this exercise. First, we're going to render the road layer. And then we're going to talk about rendering the water layer. So let's dive right in. So before we get started with it, what I want to show you is that we have already rendered the trash cans and some vehicles onto our scene right there. So hopefully you have done that as well, and we can now move on to the road and the water scene. So let's go ahead and start with the road. So we're going to find our road layer right here. I'm going to say right click, layer style settings, the library, and we're going to say highway. Let's make it 16. I'm going to say apply and OK. So if it doesn't show up, there could be a little slight problem that we can quickly fix. We're going to go back into layer style settings. We're going to go to the symbol that we selected. I'm going to edit. I'm going to say edit symbol. Now here we're going to select all of these points, and we're going to use our arrow keys to move it up a little, just enough so that we can see the road here. Right, that looks good. So we're going to say OK, and we're going to say apply, say OK again. So there we have our road all ready to go and installed in the scene. See it from different angles. So there. So now we're going to move on to our water layer, and for that we're going to click on our water layer here. I'm going to say right click, layer style settings, and in our fill library we're going to select slow water and say apply and OK. But oh, what's this? We still can't see it. Now the reason for that is that it's currently below this layer, and we're going to change its altitude mode from the styles tab to absolute. So there we have it. We can see the water now. It's all rendered. And now this is done, and we're going to move on to our next part, which is rapid modeling by vector stretching. Now the first part is to load the data, and then we change the bottom altitude and extension settings, and finally we change the texture settings, and the 2D data becomes a 3D model. So we're going to demonstrate that by means of this exercise. We're going to make some models by vector stretching, and we're going to demonstrate the fence layer and the building 2 layer. And finally, we're going to make unique thematic map, stretch each item and set their textures, which will be done in the building 1 layer. And we're going to leave the pool layer and the ground layer for you to do yourself. So let's go ahead and get on with these. So the fence layer first. Let's go ahead and select our fence layer. Now here, we're going to change the altitude mode to absolute, and we're going to select texture settings. Now here, we can select the texture file, that is the image that are going to be shown on that line there. So let's go ahead and select our texture file, which is under data folder, rapid modeling, and texture. We can select fence.png and say open. Now here we're going to say real size, and we're going to change the U and V size to some of the tables that we have already created. We're going to say side texture X and side texture Y. In extension, we're going to say stretch height. And this way we'll be able to render our fence like that. Now the next one is building 2. Now for this one, we're going to go straight into styles, and here we're going to change the altitude mode to absolute, and we're going to extend this using stretch height, and then we're going to go into texture settings, right? So here we're going to select 2 textures. One is the side texture and the other is the top texture. So let's select the side texture first. Okay, we're going to go into select file, and let's say we want this one as the side texture. Now here we can see that it doesn't really feel all that natural. So we're going to change this to real size, and we're going to change these values here. For this one, we're going to say side texture X, and for this one here, we're going to say side texture Y. So there we have it. This looks a bit more natural now, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to select our top texture as well. So we're going to say select file, and let's say that we want this one as our top texture. Now, in order to make this one more natural, we are going to change this to repeat times. And if we zoom in here, you can see that it looks a lot natural now. And last thing, we're going to change the bottom altitude to the bottom elevation, right, so that we get our bridge here. Okay, we're now going to move on to building 1. Now this one is going to be a bit more complicated than building 2 here. We're going to say right click, and we're going to say create thematic map. We're going to create a unique values map. We're going to say default, and okay. Right, so here we're going to change the unique expression first. We're going to change this to this one here. So now we see that we have an axis, we have the bottom, escapeway, frontage, hall, and side. So we've got a lot of unique sides to this model here. So we're going to change those one by one. Let's go into the texture setting, this button here, of the axis first. And we're going to change the extensive property here to item property. We're going to say absolute at altitude. And let's say that we won't change the base altitude, and we're going to extend the height to, let's say, 101. Now let's choose the texture file. So let's say we want this one as the axis, and we're going to change this to real size, and let's say we will change this to 15 and the V size to 8, right? And now let's select the texture file. Let's say we want, so let's say that we want this one as the top texture. We're going to keep this as repeat times, and we're going to leave these settings as default as well, and we're going to say apply, and we're going to say OK. So there's the axis, and we can see that it has rendered itself, right? So let's move on to the bottom. Same thing, texture settings, item property, absolute. Let's say 0, 101. Let's say 0, and now because this is the bottom, we want it to be a bit lower than the axis. So let's say we're going to keep it as 20. Texture file. Let's say we want this one for the bottom. We're going to say real size, And let's say we're going to keep this at 6, and we're going to keep the resize to 13. Top texture, let's say we want this one as the top texture, and we want to keep the rest as default. We're going to say apply and OK. So there we go. We have the axis rendered along with the top texture. So moving on, let's move on to the escape. Same thing, settings, item property, absolute, ground, and let's say we want this to be 0 and we want this to be about 103, and we're going to have, let's say, this one as the side texture, and we're going to say real size, and let's say we want it as a 5x5. Let's say for the top texture we want the same file, and we want this one to be real size, and we also want this one to be a 5x5 for consistency, and we're going to say OK. So there we have it, the escape way has been rendered. So step by step by step we are rendering these buildings here. So let's keep doing that and move on to the front edge. Settings, item property, absolute, fill and outline. Now let's say we want the base altitude to be 0 as before, and let's say we want the extended height to be around 100, and we're going to say building 1, because this looks like a front, as the side texture, and we're going to say real size and maybe 36 and 15. For the top texture, let's say we want this, and we're going to keep our consistency with the side texture, and we're going to say real size 36 and 15 and apply that. Okay. So we have the front edge here, right then. So let's keep this up. Let's move on to the whole. We're going to say settings, same, and same as the front edge. We're going to keep this to, let's say, 20. And for the texture, let's say we want this one for the front edge, and we're going to say real size 12 and 60. So same generic layer here, and we're going to leave these as default and say apply. So there we have the whole rendered right there. Right, so finally let's move on to the side layer. So same mechanical movement here, absolute, ground from an outline, and we're going to select the ground 9 image here as the texture, and we're going to say real size and maybe 45 and 15. For the top texture, we want the same generic layer, and we want to keep all the other things as default. Generic layer, default, apply. Okay. So there we have the side layer as well. So this building of ours is now complete. There we go. So now, before we exit out of here, what we want to do is that we want an advertisement screen on building 2. This one, on this building, right? So for that, we will select our add board layer, and we're going to change its altitude mode to relative to ground, and we're going to change its bottom altitude to 80 and its extension value to 50, right? So it comes right in the middle here. And then we're going to select our texture file, select file, and we're going to say realspace.gif and say open. There we go. So we have an add board right here. Perfect. Okay. So let's fix one more thing here. Now we see that our buildings have this weird tingy color. So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's go to building 1 first. We're going to go into the color ramp, and we're going to say custom, and we're going to say add color, and we're going to change both of these to white, like that, and say OK. There we go. So they're now nice and clean. They look whiter and cleaner. And that is just what we want. So let's move on to our other building, which is building 2. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go into style settings. And I'm going to say, just going to change the foreground here to white as well. And say OK. So both of them have now been cleared up and they look nice and clean. So there we have our residential scene. Right, so we can use rapid modeling by vector stretching on a scene that contains large and non-important area. For example, lots of buildings that look the same, lots of roads that look the same, lots of surroundings basically that look the same. So we can use rapid modeling by just simply stretching those areas in a uniform manner in order to fill out a lot of non-important area. Now what this does is that it saves time and it saves resources. So let's talk about the 3ds Max model. Now this is applicable to important buildings in a small area, as opposed to what we saw in the previous slide. What we do with the 3ds Max model is that we create a very detailed model in the 3ds Max software for a land feature, a building, etc. that is considered to be important. And then we can install the Supermap 3D plugin within 3ds Max to export those models, and then we can import them and use them in our scene in our desktop. So what we're looking at here is an animation model created in 3ds Max, and by using the plugin that we just talked about, we can import these animations directly into Supermap iDesktop and use them in our scenes. So let's talk a little bit about the oblique photographic model. And now the first step is to create the S3M and OSGB files, which you can see on this image right here. Now the thing is that there can be numerous files of this type. And in order to use these, we're going to generate something called an OSGB file, which looks something like this, and it creates a cache out of all of these files. And then finally, we can add this OSGB cache layer in order to stitch all of these different S3M or OSGB files together to get a scene like this that can have numerous applications. Now, a little more detail about the BIM file. We can use a specific plugin to export the BIM models into a file data source, which we can then open within iDesktop. Now these files store the BIM models. We can also optimize the BIM models in iDesktop, and finally we can add the BIM models into a 3D scene. So that's all for this tutorial on 3D models. Please practice the techniques that we have learned in this tutorial by rendering the ground and parking layers in the residential scene that we saw. And if you have more questions, please turn to the help document or contact us directly. Thank you.